welcome to a discussion on social class in India. The term social class, as you know, generally refers to hierarchical distinctions between people or communities in any society. Most societies have some form of class distinctions or hierarchical distinctions. In India, as you know, caste has been the traditional hierarchical arrangement, and in that context the word or the term social class becomes very difficult to capture in any kind of essentialist notion, because it has a lot of overlaps with the caste system in India. I don't want to venture into any kind of preliminary statements and what exactly constitutes class, but generally I think the notion of class has been equated with some kind of economic resource base. So a lot of times when we talk of class categories, we talk about the economic status of an individual or a community or a group of people. But again, this is not enough to really capture the nuanced arrangements in which people find themselves, and there are various other factors which go into the making of a class structure: the social capital, the resources, the educational levels, the political clout a community or a group of people may have or may not. So to discuss all these complexities and the nuances of class structure in India, especially in the context of the changing processes of recent times, we have with us Professor Surinder Jodhka. He is an eminent scholar and a professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University. His specializations include agrarian social structure in India, as well as a study of caste and identity politics in India. I welcome Professor Jodhka. I'm very glad that you're here with us in our studios, and let me start straight away with a question which perhaps helps our students to locate class in Indian society. So what would your take on that, or your ideas on it?
Yeah, broadly speaking, there are two perspectives on class. One, as we know, is the Marxian perspective, and the other one is the Weberian perspective. I think it would depend on what perspective we begin with. That would help us whether class is there in India or not. If one was to begin with Marxian perspective, then all societies after the primitive societies are class based societies. There are class based divisions. Some people own property, other people don't own property, some are landowners, some are landless, and they have to interact with each other, they have to work with each other, and when they come together to work with each other in order to produce for survival, then you have emergence of a class structure. For Weberian kind of perspective, class is more of a historical category. In a sense, it's specific to modern capitalist societies or a system of production which are organized around rational system of authority. For example, caste for Weber would be a status system and not a class system, while for Marxist, caste would also be kind of a class system. So that would depend, that would determine whether we begin from, say, pre-modern times, or we begin with the modern capitalist society when it begins with the introduction of modern industry during the colonial period. So I would say that classes have been there in India. I would prefer perhaps a Marxist perspective, though there are in certain kind of context Weberian perspective becomes more useful. But there have been class divisions in society, even in rural India, where you have category of caste overriding the consciousness of people. You have had categories like Malik, Mazdoor, Zamindar, Chote Log, Bade Log. These are essentially class based categories in the sense that they refer to their ownership or non-ownership of land and the corresponding authority that it commands. So class has been in India, has been there in Indian society for a very long time. We have had kind of feudal society also, feudal structure also, intermediaries, zamindars, and then you've also had kind of a ruling class in India of kings and queens who have had their own kind of culture and their own system of authority. And things changed obviously, and we have much more nuanced system of class inequality emerging in India with the establishment of the British colonial rule, or with the development of capitalism, when cities start coming up, industries developed, and now we also have development of capitalism in Indian agriculture. So in agriculture also you can easily find 3 or 4 or 5 very different classes. So classes exist in India, and as they exist in all modern societies or contemporary societies.
So, I mean, just as a corollary to what you said, as an additional question, then would you then suggest that there is a great overlap between the caste system as was traditionally available, even with the changes that are happening, and with the class system?
Yes, caste and class overlap.
Yes.
Caste cannot be reduced to class or vice versa. Caste is a different thing. Caste is in a sense much more than class. So caste is a reality which should also be looked at as such. But there is a very strong link between caste and class in most parts of India. For example, people who are Dalits or ex-untouchable communities, they are the ones who work as landless laborers and they don't own land. It's the middle level agrarian castes who invariably always own land. So there is definitely an overlap, but one should not say that caste is class or class is caste in Indian case.
How would you comprehend the class situation in India in the present context, especially with globalization and the shifts in economic organizations or reorganizations?
I think we should handle this question at 2 levels. One is at the level of perspectives. How do we look at Indian society? How have sociologists or journalists or policymakers been talking about Indian society? And second is the level of empirical reality. At the first level, over the last 10-15 years, the perspective of class has become much more peripheral to Indian society. We don't speak in terms of class. In 70s and 80s, the perspective of class was much more popular. We talked about agriculture in terms of zamindars and landlords, landless laborers, the whole discourse of development, Indian development, for example, when we talked about land reforms after independence, that was also carried out in a kind of language of class, that there are people who are intermediaries, absentee landlords, peasants, middle farmers, all these were class categories. And if land has to be distributed, then you identify landless laborers or tenants. These again are class categories. Similarly, if you look at the urban kind of industrial sector, there was a very strong working class movement, and working classes had their own trade unions. Those trade unions came together. They in a sense popularized a particular discourse of class, and we did speak in terms of Indian bourgeoisie, Indian middle classes, Indian working classes. Freedom movement was also explained using those kinds of categories. So until 80s, the perspective of class was very popular in India, both with academics as well as in the political circles. The policymakers also used the category of class in order to kind of evolve policies. With liberalization process in 1990s at the global level, there has been a kind of decline of class perspective. This is also linked to the larger shifts that have taken place at the global level, the collapse of Soviet Union, for example, and a shift that take place in China from a kind of socialist society. China tries to become a more market friendly society, and that in a sense gave a sense to people that there is end of history. So you are not going to have a class revolution. There is not going to be a proletariat revolution. So capitalism is not a historical phase which would end as Marx had predicted, but it's something that is going to be the normal state of society in future. So people stopped talking about class. They started talking about civil society. They started talking about inequalities, but not in class terms. That these are kind of realities and people will live together. But that doesn't mean that class has disappeared. If you look at China or India or any other part of the world, in the last 20 years, 15 years, what is known as the age of neoliberalism, social inequalities have actually increased. Yes, I mean, if you look at the working class formations, there is very little evidence to show that there is a kind of class consciousness emerging among the people who have become poorer because of liberalization. So that is still not evident. But yes, I mean, inequalities have increased. The large number of people who are dispossessed of properties, there are people who are poor, and this is not true about India. It is true about many parts of the world. I mean, in America, for example, there is much more talk about inequalities today than it used to be 20 years back or 15 years back. Same is the case with China. Inequalities are increasing very rapidly, and how is the Chinese government going to deal with it? One doesn't know, because officially they still believe in kind of socialist pattern of society, or socialist pattern of development. India also has that problem. I mean, we have had all kinds of problems, but class inequalities are definitely there. If you look at the nature of Indian workforce, agriculture is in crisis, industry has its own problems. It's just that I think there are newer kind of realities. They need to be captured with innovative categories which use class perspective, but at the same time are able to capture the emerging realities of class relations.
I do agree with you that class as a perspective has really taken a backstage, but at the same time, in the face of neoliberalization, or the age of neoliberalization as you put it, there is also an increasing attention on the role of middle class, or the changing dynamics and the position of middle class. How would you see the emerging middle class in this scenario?
See, in the whole theoretical as well as empirical literature on class, middle class is a very interesting category. It in a sense stands apart. It doesn't really fit into the larger discourse on class, which is around inequalities. So middle class in a sense is a separate topic, is a separate subject, and while discourse of class declines in Indian social sciences during the 90s and the first decade of 21st century, middle class is talked about much more, right? It's the expansion of middle class, is the consuming middle class. So middle class is not seen as a class. Middle class is seen as a kind of social category which has disposable income, which goes to the market, buys things, consumes, educates its children well. So middle class in a sense is seen more in Weberian term, as a kind of status group, or as a category which is not really in a contradictory location. It kind of tends to multiply itself, or it expands, and on the basis of this middle class you have a kind of middle class culture which is otherwise known as the modern culture. This is the middle class which in a sense globalizes India. Middle class is the location that brings the world to India and goes to the world. So middle class of India today is not just Indian middle class, it is by definition globalized, because it is open to global exposures. It is also economically connected with the global economy. So it sends its children to study abroad, and they work in corporations which are transnational corporations. So middle class is a kind of totally different category sociologically, the way it is being talked about today.
What about the rural class structure? How do you see the dynamics in rural agrarian, particularly the agrarian?
The way we understood rural class structure in 1970s and 80s was drawing from the writings of people like starting with Karl Marx, but more importantly from the writings of people like Lenin and Mao, who had actually worked with the rural kind of societies and had tried to organize a revolution in those societies. So for example, Lenin talked about Russia or Russian agriculture through a 4 or 5 class model, and he also talked about what is known as differentiation of peasantry, that peasants were a kind of homogeneous class. With development of capitalism, they get differentiated into different classes, and at the end of the day there would be 2 classes in rural areas. There would be agrarian bourgeoisie and there would be agrarian proletariat, like capitalism or capitalist development in kind of industrial society, and that's when agriculture becomes a kind of part of the industrial society. In the transition period, you'll have 4 or 5 classes. At the top you would have big landlords, then you'll have rich farmers, then you have middle peasants, then you have small peasants, then you have poor peasants, and then you have landless laborers. But this is a period of transition. Before that you either have homogeneous peasantry, or you have feudalism, where you have serfs and their lords. And eventually after the transition there would be kind of 2 classes. That's the kind of framework with which we started looking at Indian agriculture, that yes, Indian agriculture also has this 4 or 5 class model. People tried to use various criteria to identify those classes. One was just look at land ownership, other was to look at who employs labor and who gets employed as laborer. So people who would employ others as laborers would be in the category of exploiting classes, and people who sell their labor power to others, they would be exploited classes. So on that basis they also worked out 4 or 5 kind of class model. Now this whole framework of class to study agrarian social structure does not hold good any longer in most parts of India. It perhaps never did. One is that it never took notice of the concrete cultural historical realities of Indian society, which we were talking about earlier, the reality of caste system. So you cannot talk about class inequalities without referring to caste at all, which it did not. I mean, the whole discourse on agrarian class structure did not talk about caste at all. Second is, if you look at rural areas, particularly in regions which have experienced green revolution, where some kind of capitalist development has taken place, there has been interesting kind of internal differentiation. And this differentiation is not only at the class level, but this differentiation is also at the household level. So in the whole agrarian classification of classes, we take household as the unit. There is a one family, peasant is a family farm. So the whole husband, wife and children, sometime extended family, the entire family is identified with agricultural occupation, and it is their position in the larger mode of production that one would identify classes. Now what you have is, in one house, in one family, you have 3 working members. One person works in the town as a constable or a school teacher or as a driver. Second person has migrated out somewhere else and works in Bombay or Calcutta or in some other city. Third person stays on in the village and works on land. So all these 3 are, in a sense, their income is pooled, or some people would be going out. So there is internal differentiation. So one has to negotiate with this, and for that we need more work. So agrarian classes are still there, in the sense that if you look at the rural society today, land is owned by only around 10 to 20% people, and large number of people work on land as landless laborers. So there is also third class of traders who are kind of directly connected with agriculture, and they play a very important role. I mean, the current crisis of agriculture, where farmers are committing suicide, their traders play important role. So the farmers are invariably indebted to the traders, and they have to take their farm yield to the market, and through the market the traders exercises an influence on the way agrarian production takes place and the way agrarian social structure reproduces itself. So you have 3-4 classes which are very actively involved in agricultural operations, but they still need to be conceptualized. I think that is still quite an open thing.
An additional question in with reference to the agrarian class structure I have is, with one notices a certain kind of dynamism, especially when you see it in the context of electoral politics. There are a whole new emergent classes which are really coming up. What is the significance of these political inroads into the actual class structures? How do you see these interaction, or how do you see this connection?
See, India still has nearly 70% of its population living in rural areas, even though contribution of agriculture to the national income has declined very rapidly, and now it is something around 18%. So you have more than half of your working population still dependent on agriculture. So politically, rural India becomes very critical, because numerically that's where the votes are. So that's why the relationship between state and the village is very active in India. And there is a category that we use in agrarian studies, and that is called populism. So if you look at the agrarian policies of Government of India, of all political parties, they invariably resort to populism. What is populism? Populism tends to look at village as a homogeneous category, as if there were no internal differences within the village, right? So when you talk about farmer suicides, you don't talk about cultivating farmers or marginalized farmers, you talk about village India. You talk about entire rural India. So as if the rural India is entirely in crisis, right? So that, I think, is something which is very specific to India. The kind of historical and social base you have for populist kind of politics, and political leadership cannot not interact with the village. but village doesn't really respond in the manner in which they hope it would respond, because village has changed quite a lot. And there are significant variations across regions, but still all over India you have some kind of a disintegration of the older structures of authority. For example, Jajmani relations do not in a sense control lives of Dalits any longer, right? Even when there are some kinds of ideas emerging from the Jajmani kind of structure which are still prevalent in rural India, most of the Dalits don't see themselves as being tied to those norms of life, of the caste system. So they move out, and they're always eager to move out of the village, they're eager to go into other occupations. They don't see that it is their moral duty to do the kind of occupations that were prescribed to them by the caste system or by the village kind of authorities or by whatever religion, etc., etc. So they don't believe in those ideas. And also with the process of mechanization, with the process of development of capitalism in agriculture, the requirement of those occupations has also declined. So many of those occupations have become redundant. For example, pottery. Many people have their refrigerators at home and they use water bottles. So they don't need pot. Or in urban areas, poor people would prefer a plastic pot rather than an earthen pot, because plastic pot is likely to last much longer. You have jugs, you have. So similarly, the work that carpenters used to do is no longer required. All that has become mechanized and it is done by heavy machinery. Agriculture labor has also changed. You have huge machinery. For example, if you go to the green revolution areas of western UP, Haryana, Punjab, harvesting of wheat used to take something like 2 months' time. Now it gets over in less than 2 weeks' time. You have combined harvesters, you have threshers. So all these machines have transformed rural India. So the transformation has not been similar for everyone. So the village society in a sense has disintegrated. Agrarian structure is much more porous and loose today. I mean, you have some kind of old authority still continuing in the village, but that has internally disintegrated. The logic is not there. It cannot hold it together. Then the process of democratization has played its own role. Indian democracy has been a very kind of successful experiment. People go out to vote, they think about the power their vote yields and they exercise it. So there are quotas. Now at the local level you have quotas for women and Dalits, 30% or 33% for women. So all those things are transforming social relations at the local level. And these transformations then reflect themselves at the regional and national level. So that's why our politics has become much more uncertain. It's not very easy for one political party to think that it would win anyway, right? It kind of, you have to actually work very hard with people. So regional parties which have local roots, local connections, find it much easier to work with these newly emergent aspirations of people who were on the margins of society than the national parties like BJP and Congress, because they worked with a kind of umbrella ideology of patronage. So that doesn't work any longer. You have to actually respond to the needs of people on the ground. So it's a kind of rapidly changing and very fluid situation.
In this fluid situation, I mean, and with the traditional sources of authority disintegrating, would you then hazard a sort of a broad generalization as to who are the emerging classes, who are the ruling class, if one were to use such a word, and what would be their practices of hegemonic practices?
Yeah, ruling classes, if one was to talk about India as a whole, definitely the people who have who control industry. I mean, the corporate sector, for example, corporate sector is the most influential sector in India today, right? If one was to look at India in class terms, India certainly is a capitalist society, and in a capitalist society you have some kind of industrial service sector bourgeoisie which has emerged as very powerful kind of class. But this bourgeoisie is not the bourgeoisie of 19th century or even of the 20th century. This is the bourgeoisie of 21st century, which is by definition global. So there is a kind of new bourgeoisie which is emerging in India, which in a sense has already emerged, which is not only Tatas and Birlas. You have all kinds of people who are in the software industry, and who are internationally connected. So we cannot talk about Indian capitalism as being Indian, right? That doesn't mean that it becomes comprador capitalism, as earlier some people used to call. So we are living in a globalized economy where markets are integrated, and the kind of influence that corporate sector has, it is mediated through local, cultural and institutional kind of structures. So you have Sonys and Boeings holding some kind of power in India, but it is mediated through their Indian employees. So these are not colonizers. So one cannot use the old framework of recolonization the way some people try to do. So this is something on which I think we need to do much more work.
Could you very briefly indicate the response of the Indian sociologists to the class situation in India?
Right now, Indian sociologists are not doing much work on class. That is the problem why some of these emerging realities are not being conceptualized. But yes, until 1980s or early 90s, sociologists, there was a large number of sociologists who used to work on India through a class perspective. I think one of the first sociologists to look at Indian society with a class framework was A.R. Desai, who wrote this famous book on social background to Indian nationalism, where he tried to explain how nationalism emerges in India using the Marxian framework of class. And after that, several other people, who particularly those who worked on agrarian society, but also on urban working classes, they used class framework to make sense of what Indian society was. This in a sense begins to decline in 1990s, and to some extent for good reasons, because the kind of class perspective that some of us worked with was also not very open. We thought classes were similar everywhere. So whatever happened in Soviet Union would happen in India also. The way classes emerged in England would happen in India also. Caste would eventually become class. So that was not to happen, right? So we worked with a very kind of simplistic notion of class, and that was in a sense weak, conceptually weak. Since 90s, we have been preoccupied with the study of caste, study of gender, study of culture, study of ethnicity, nationalism. So class has gone to the background, and that is also what we started with, that historically speaking, the perspective of class has become less popular today. But I think it is coming back. It's something which is coming back because of the way world is changing, right?
Well, thank you very much for this very insightful overview and a very lucid presentation, I must say, because something as complex as class to be captured in this way is very fruitful for us. Thank you very much for coming to our studios, and thank you, my friend.
Thank you.